The person you love has been carrying words they can no longer keep buried. They have tried to stay quiet, tried to move forward, tried to convince themselves that the moment had already passed. But today, something inside them refuses to stay silent. And what they need to tell you may completely change the way you understand everything that happened between you. Listen carefully, because this is not simply about missing you. It is about a truth they should have admitted long ago. For a very long time, they believed silence would protect everyone. They believed keeping their feelings hidden would prevent more pain, more questions, and more conflict. But instead, that silence became the very thing that kept them awake at night. Every time your memory returned, every time someone mentioned love, commitment, or the future, their mind somehow found its way back to you. There is something they desperately wish you understood. You were never as easy to forget as they pretended. They may have looked strong on the outside. They may have continued with their normal life, smiled around other people, and acted as though everything between you had become part of the past. But behind closed doors, there were moments when that strength disappeared completely. Because deep inside, they knew there was one conversation with you that had never truly ended. And now they are hoping you somehow see this today, because waiting has started to feel more painful than speaking. They are tired of wondering what would happen if they finally told you everything. They are tired of imagining whether you would listen, whether you would understand, or whether your heart has already closed that door forever. But there is one thing they fear even more than rejection, living with the possibility that you might never know how deeply their feelings survived. Don't skip this, because this is where the truth becomes heavier. There was a moment when they almost reached out to you. They had the words ready. They knew exactly what they wanted to say. But something stopped them. Fear. Pride. Timing. Maybe even another person's influence. Whatever it was, they stepped back, and they have regretted that decision far more than anyone around them realizes. Because what they wanted to tell you was not simply, "I miss you." It was something much deeper. They wanted to admit that losing the connection with you forced them to see things they had refused to see before. They began recognizing which relationships were genuine, which promises were empty, and which people had been influencing decisions that should have belonged to their own heart. Slowly, painfully, they started realizing that some of the choices they once defended may have cost them the one connection they never truly wanted to lose. And there is one memory of you that keeps returning stronger than all the others. A moment that seemed ordinary when it happened, but now carries an entirely different meaning. Something you said. Something you did. Maybe even the way you looked at them when nobody else understood what they were going through. They remember it because now they understand something they couldn't understand then. You were giving them something emotionally real, and they didn't recognize its value until distance made it impossible to ignore. Today, they wish they could go back and respond differently. They wish they had asked you to stay a little longer. They wish they had spoken instead of assuming there would always be another opportunity. But there is something else they need to tell you, and this is the part they have been most afraid to admit. Something recently happened that made them realize they may not have unlimited time to keep postponing this conversation. It forced them to confront one question they had avoided for far too long. What if you move forward before I finally tell you the truth? That question shook them. Because suddenly, the thought of permanently losing their chance to speak became more frightening than the possibility of hearing an answer they weren't prepared for. And now a decision is forming inside them. A decision involving you. But before they make it, there is one confession they need you to hear first, and once you understand what they have been hiding, you may finally understand why they couldn't let this connection go. That confession has been sitting inside them for much longer than you realize. They kept telling themselves there would be a better day, a safer moment, a perfect opportunity to finally explain everything. But that perfect moment never came. Instead, the distance grew heavier, the unanswered questions became louder, and every attempt to ignore what they still felt for you only made one truth impossible to escape: they never emotionally finished what began between you. There were nights when they replayed old conversations in their mind, searching for the exact moment everything changed. They wondered whether one different sentence could have saved everything. They remembered moments when you were trying to tell them something important, but they were too overwhelmed, too influenced by circumstances around them, or simply too afraid to understand what your words really meant. And now those memories hurt differently, because they finally recognize what they couldn't recognize then. You may have been fighting for the connection while they were allowing fear to make decisions for them. But here is what they have been hiding. At some point after the distance began, someone asked them a question about you. It was unexpected and painfully simple. If you could speak to that person one more time without anyone interfering, what would you say? They froze. They tried to laugh it away. They tried changing the subject. But their reaction revealed more than any answer could have. Because suddenly their eyes filled with everything they had been refusing to say. Later, when they were alone, that question followed them. What would they say to you if nobody else had an opinion? If there were no expectations, no pride, no past arguments, and no fear of looking vulnerable? The answer came immediately. They would tell you they are sorry for every moment their silence made you believe you didn't matter. They would tell you that distance never erased your importance. And most importantly, they would admit that there were times when they wanted to choose you openly but allowed circumstances around them to become louder than their own heart. Don't skip this part, because something changed after that night. They stopped asking themselves whether they still cared about you. They already knew the answer. Instead, they started asking whether they were brave enough to finally do something about it. That was an entirely different question, because feelings can remain hidden forever, but action requires courage. For the first time, they began imagining what would happen if they actually contacted you. Would you answer? Would you be angry? Would you remain silent? Would you tell them they waited too long? Every possibility frightened them. Yet one possibility frightened them even more: reaching the end of this chapter without ever giving you the truth you deserved. So they began preparing the words. Not a dramatic speech. Not excuses. Not promises they couldn't guarantee. Just the truth. They wanted to tell you, I know I cannot change what happened. I know I cannot ask you to forget the pain. But I need you to know that what I felt for you did not disappear simply because we stopped speaking. And there is another sentence they have rehearsed privately, one they have never been brave enough to say aloud. If I had understood then what I understand now, I would have fought much harder for us. Those words carry enormous weight for them because admitting this means admitting they made choices they regret. It means accepting that some of the people they listened to did not understand the connection the way they did. It means acknowledging that fear influenced decisions that affected both of you. But something even more unexpected happened recently. Someone close to them noticed the change. This person saw how your person reacted when your name came up. They saw the sudden silence, the distant expression, the way their entire mood shifted within seconds. And instead of ignoring it, this person confronted them directly. You're still waiting for them, aren't you? Your person didn't answer. They didn't need to. That silence exposed everything. And what happened immediately afterward is the reason they are desperately hoping you see this now, because for the first time, they revealed what they actually intend to do about you. But the decision they admitted was far bigger than anyone expected. The room became completely silent after that question. Your person could have denied everything. They could have laughed, changed the subject, or repeated the same explanation they had given everyone for so long. But this time, they were exhausted from pretending. They looked down for a moment, gathered themselves, and finally admitted something nobody around them expected to hear. I never stopped hoping there would be another chance to speak to them. That confession changed the entire conversation. Because suddenly, this was no longer about an old memory they occasionally thought about. This was about a connection they had quietly carried through every attempt to move forward. The person sitting across from them immediately asked the question they had been avoiding, then why haven't you done anything? And that question hit harder than anything else, because there was no comfortable answer anymore. Your person finally admitted that fear had controlled them. They were afraid you wouldn't answer. Afraid you had completely moved on. Afraid that after everything that happened, they no longer had the right to walk back into your life and ask you to listen. But underneath every one of those fears was something even deeper. They knew that contacting you would force them to take responsibility for the decisions that helped create this distance. They could no longer blame timing. They could no longer blame other people. They could no longer hide behind circumstances. If they came toward you now, they would have to come with the truth. And that is exactly what they decided to do. They said, if I get one opportunity to speak to them, I am not going to waste it defending myself. I am going to tell them what really happened, what I should have done differently, and why I never completely let go. The person listening was stunned because your person had never spoken with that kind of certainty before. Something had shifted. The hesitation was still there, but it was no longer stronger than the regret. They had finally reached the point where remaining silent felt more dangerous than discovering how you might respond. And then they made an even bigger admission. They revealed that they had already started writing something for you. Not a casual message. Not a simple, "How have you been?" They had been putting together everything they wished they had told you before the distance became so painful. Every apology they swallowed. Every feeling they hid. Every moment they wanted to contact you but stopped themselves. They wanted you to finally understand the complete story instead of carrying only the version created by silence. There was one sentence, however, that they kept deleting and writing again. "I never wanted our last chapter to be the way you remember it." Every time they wrote those words, they became emotional because they knew exactly what they meant. They didn't want the misunderstandings, outside pressure, or painful ending to become the final definition of what existed between you. Whatever happens next, they want you to know there was more happening inside them than you were ever allowed to see. But before they could finish that message, something happened. They discovered something about the past that made them stop writing completely. A detail they had never known. A truth connected to the period when the two of you became distant. And suddenly, several things that had confused them for years started making sense. They began asking questions. They went back through old conversations in their mind. They remembered who had been around them during that time, what they had been told, and which decisions they had made because they believed information that now seemed incomplete. Then one person finally admitted something. It wasn't the entire truth. But it was enough. Enough to make your person realize that one of the biggest misunderstandings between you and them may never have belonged between you in the first place. That realization hit them hard. Because now they weren't only thinking about contacting you to confess their feelings. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what you had actually experienced while they were being told an entirely different version. And most of all, they wanted to ask you one question they had been terrified to ask for years. Did you really walk away from me? Or did something happen that neither of us fully understood? That question changed everything. Because your person is no longer looking at the past the same way. And the next thing they uncovered may explain why this message suddenly became too urgent to keep waiting. What they uncovered did not give them peace. It gave them even more questions. Your person had spent so much time believing the ending between you happened because one of you simply stopped fighting for the connection. But now they were beginning to understand that the situation may have been far more complicated. Certain conversations had been repeated differently. Certain intentions had been misunderstood. And some important words may never have reached the person they were meant for. That realization shook them because they immediately remembered one specific moment from the past. They remembered waiting for something from you, a call, an explanation, some sign that you still cared. When it never came, they accepted the silence as your answer. What they didn't know was that you may have been waiting for exactly the same thing from them. Two people waiting. Two people hurting. Two people interpreting silence in completely different ways. And neither one knowing what was happening inside the other. Your person sat with that realization for a long time. Suddenly, anger wasn't the strongest emotion anymore. Regret was. Because they began wondering how different everything might have been if they had ignored everyone else for 5 minutes and simply asked you directly, "Is this really what you want?" But they never asked. And now that question has been haunting them. They began looking back at every assumption they once treated like a fact. Who told them you didn't care anymore? Who convinced them you had already moved forward? Why did they believe that version without hearing your side? These questions became impossible to ignore, and for the first time, they admitted that some of their certainty about the past had been built on things they never personally confirmed. That is why the message they were writing to you changed completely. Originally, they wanted to explain themselves. Now they want to listen to you. They want to know what you saw, what you heard, what you believed, and what you were feeling when everything started falling apart. They no longer want to approach you with a carefully rehearsed version of events. They want one conversation where both sides can finally exist in the same room without anyone else speaking between them. And there is one thing they are prepared to say immediately. "I should have asked you instead of assuming." Those words are difficult for them because they carry responsibility. They cannot erase the past by saying them. They cannot demand forgiveness. They cannot decide what you should feel after hearing them. But they have finally understood that if they ever receive another opportunity with you, honesty has to come before pride. Don't skip this, because their next decision surprised even the person who had been encouraging them to speak. Your person decided they would stop waiting for some perfect sign. They said there would never be a perfect moment to confront something this emotional. There would always be fear. There would always be uncertainty. And there would always be another excuse to wait one more day. But they are tired of one more day. They are tired of wondering. They are tired of rehearsing conversations with you that never actually happen. And they are especially tired of carrying words that belong in your hands, not inside their head. So they finished the message. They read it once. Then again. Their finger hovered over the screen. For several seconds, they almost sent it. But right before they did, another thought stopped them, not because they had changed their mind about you, but because there was one final truth they needed to include. The truth they had been most ashamed to admit. They added one final paragraph explaining what happened during the exact period when they appeared to choose distance over you. They explained what they were afraid of, what pressure they were experiencing, and why they made a decision that looked completely different from what they actually felt. Then came the hardest sentence. "I thought walking away would make everything easier for everyone. I never understood how much it would destroy inside me." They stared at those words. Because that was the confession underneath every other confession. They had tried to make the right decision according to everything happening around them, but somewhere along the way, they stopped asking whether that decision was right for their own heart. Now they understand the cost. And they also understand something else. You may not be standing exactly where they left you. Your life may have changed. Your feelings may have changed. You may have boundaries they must respect. They know they cannot return expecting everything to become what it once was. That isn't what they are asking for. They are asking for the chance to finally tell the truth. Because whether this connection receives another chapter or finally receives closure, they cannot tolerate the idea of leaving you with a story that was never complete. But here is where everything becomes even more intense. Before they could decide whether to send that final message, their phone suddenly lit up. They looked at the screen, and what they saw made their heart race instantly. Because something connected directly to you had appeared at the exact moment they were preparing to reveal everything. For several seconds, they couldn't move. And now they are wondering whether this is finally the moment they have been waiting for, or the last opportunity they will ever get to tell you what their heart has refused to forget. For several seconds, they simply stared at that screen. Their heart was beating so hard that everything around them seemed to disappear. What appeared wasn't necessarily the answer they had been waiting for, but it was enough to bring you back into the center of their thoughts at the exact moment they had finally decided to stop running from the truth. And that timing affected them deeply. They had spent so long telling themselves to wait, to be careful, to protect their pride, but suddenly every excuse sounded weaker than the words sitting unfinished in front of them. They put the phone down, walked away, and tried to calm themselves. But they couldn't. Your person realized they were standing at the same emotional crossroads they had faced before. Speak now or remain silent and possibly regret it again. Only this time, they understood exactly what silence could cost. They had already lived through that pain once. They knew what it felt like to wake up months later wishing they had been braver for 5 minutes. So they returned to the message. They read every word again. The apology, the explanation, the questions, the confession. And then they reached the final paragraph, the one that frightened them most because there was nowhere to hide inside it. It didn't blame another person. It didn't blame timing or circumstances. It simply admitted what their heart had known for a long time. I still care about you. I don't know what that means for us now, and I won't pretend I know how you feel. But I couldn't continue letting you believe that what we had meant nothing to me. That was the truth. Simple. Vulnerable. Terrifying. They knew sending those words wouldn't guarantee the outcome they secretly hoped for. You could respond warmly. You could ask difficult questions. You could tell them you need time. You could even decide that too much has happened to reopen that door. Your person understands all of those possibilities now. But for the first time, they are prepared to respect your answer instead of allowing fear to prevent the question from ever being asked. Because this isn't about forcing the past to return. It's about finally giving the truth a voice. And something else happened while they were sitting there. They remembered the version of you who once waited for them to become certain. They remembered how many times you showed patience when they were confused. How many times you tried to understand what they couldn't explain. Those memories made them realize that if they come toward you now, they cannot come with half-truths. They have to tell you everything. They have to admit the moment they realized they had made a mistake. They have to admit how many times they almost contacted you. They have to explain why they stopped themselves. And they have to tell you about the one conversation that completely changed how they understood your separation. That conversation happened recently. Someone who had been present during one of the most difficult periods between you finally said something your person had never heard before. They explained that you had not been as indifferent as your person was led to believe. According to what they remembered, you had been hurt, confused, and waiting for clarity too. Your person immediately asked, "Why didn't anyone tell me this then?" There was a long silence. No satisfying answer came. And that silence told them enough. They walked away from that conversation feeling devastated, not because it proved every assumption wrong, but because it showed them how little they had actually known about your side of the story. For years, they had built conclusions around incomplete information. Now those conclusions were collapsing. That night, they couldn't sleep. They kept imagining what you might say if they finally asked you directly. Maybe your version would be completely different. Maybe some things would be painful to hear. Maybe they would discover mistakes on both sides. But they wanted the truth anyway. Because uncertainty had already taken enough from them. And this is why they desperately hope you see this today. Emotionally, they have reached a point where postponing everything feels impossible. Something inside them has changed. The fear hasn't disappeared, but regret has become stronger than fear. They don't want another year of wondering. They don't want another important moment to pass while pretending they don't care. They don't want to hear your name someday and realize they allowed their final opportunity for honesty to disappear because they were too afraid to speak. So they made themselves one promise. If an opportunity to have that conversation appears, they will not run from it again. No games. No pretending. No hiding behind other people's opinions. They want to look at the entire story honestly and finally hear your truth from you. But there is still one thing they haven't told anyone. Before everything fell apart between you, your person had made a private decision about your future together. A decision they never got the chance, or courage, to reveal. And now, after everything that has surfaced, that forgotten decision has returned to their mind. Because what they were once preparing to tell you proves that before the separation happened, they had been thinking far more seriously about your future than you were ever allowed to know. And that is the final secret they are struggling to decide whether they should reveal. That final secret has been buried beneath years of silence, regret, and unfinished conversations. Your person never expected to confront it again because admitting it would force them to acknowledge just how close they once came to changing everything between you. Before the confusion, before the distance, before outside voices became louder than their own feelings, they had privately decided they wanted something real with you. Not another temporary chapter. Not another uncertain connection. They had started imagining what it would actually mean to build a future where you were no longer standing on opposite sides of uncertainty. They never told you. That is the part they regret most. There was a moment when they were preparing to have a serious conversation with you. They had rehearsed it privately because they wanted to finally stop leaving you confused about where you stood. They wanted to tell you that despite all their hesitation, you had become the person they could imagine beside them when life became quieter and all the noise disappeared. But before that conversation happened, circumstances changed. Tension appeared. Words were misunderstood. Other opinions entered the picture, and the conversation your person had been preparing was replaced by silence. For a long time, they convinced themselves that maybe it was supposed to happen that way. Maybe losing you was necessary. Maybe moving forward separately was the mature decision. They repeated those explanations until they almost sounded believable. Almost. Because whenever they imagined the future honestly, one question kept returning. What would have happened if I had simply told you what I was planning? That question became impossible to answer. And now, after learning that you may have experienced the separation very differently from what they believed, the regret has become even stronger. Your person is realizing that while you may have been wondering whether they ever truly cared, they were privately preparing to tell you exactly how much they did. The tragedy wasn't necessarily a lack of feeling. It was everything that remained unsaid. That is why they no longer want to send you a message filled with dramatic promises. They want something more meaningful than that. They want honesty. They want accountability. They want to finally place the truth in front of you and allow you to decide what it means. They know they cannot return expecting you to erase what happened. They know your heart may have changed. They know time may have created boundaries that deserve respect. But they also know that you deserve the truth long before now. And the truth is this. There were moments when they chose silence even though their heart wanted you. There were moments when they listened to fear instead of asking you directly. There were moments when pride prevented them from admitting they were hurting. And there were moments when they hoped you would somehow understand feelings they never had the courage to explain. Now they recognize how unfair that was. You were never supposed to read their mind. You were never supposed to carry the responsibility for words they refused to speak. That realization has changed something fundamental inside them. For the first time, they are not asking, "Will you come back?" They are asking, "Can I finally be brave enough to tell you the truth without demanding anything in return?" And that difference matters. Because whatever happens afterward, your person wants the next decision to be based on reality, not rumors, assumptions, fear, or other people's interpretations. They want you to hear their side. And they want to hear yours. They want to know whether there was ever a moment when you were waiting too. Whether you almost reached out. Whether you believed they had stopped caring. Whether the ending that both of you accepted was built partly on things neither of you ever confirmed. But there is one question they are even more afraid to ask. If I had told you then that I wanted a future with you, Would you have stayed? They have imagined your answer countless times. Sometimes they imagine you saying yes. Sometimes they imagine silence. Sometimes they imagine you telling them that they waited too long. But they finally understand that imagining your answer is not the same as hearing your truth. And that is why this can't wait much longer. Your person has spent enough time living inside imagined conversations. They want the real one. They want the conversation where nobody else speaks for you. Nobody else speaks for them. No old assumptions control what happens next. Just two people finally looking at the same story from both sides. And somewhere deep inside, your person knows this conversation could change everything, or finally bring clarity to something that has remained unfinished for far too long. Either possibility frightens them. But neither frightens them as much as silence anymore. Because they have already learned what silence can destroy. So now the message is ready. The confession is ready. The questions they have avoided are ready. And your person knows that once those words are finally spoken, there may be no returning to the comfortable distance where everything could remain unanswered. The truth will be out. You will finally know what they were planning before everything collapsed. You will know how deeply they regretted never telling you. And you will know why, after all this time, they still couldn't completely close the chapter. But before they reveal everything, there is one final decision they have to make. Do they protect themselves one more time? Or finally risk hearing your answer? Because this time, if the door opens even slightly, they have promised themselves one thing. They will not let fear speak for them again. And that promise is exactly what has brought them to this moment. For the first time, your person is no longer searching for another excuse to delay what their heart has been demanding. They have already seen what fear can do. They have already experienced what happens when assumptions replace conversations, when pride replaces vulnerability, and when two people leave important words unspoken because both believe there will always be more time. They do not want to repeat that mistake with you. Something has changed in the way they think about you now. Before, every memory brought fear and regret. Now those same memories are giving them courage. They are beginning to understand that whatever answer you eventually give, knowing the truth is better than spending another year trapped inside questions. They would rather discover that your life has moved in another direction than continue pretending they don't desperately want to know where your heart stands. And there is one particular memory they cannot escape. It was one of your final meaningful conversations before everything became complicated. At the time, your person did not understand the weight of something you said. They heard the words, but they didn't truly listen to what was underneath them. Now, looking back, they wonder whether you were giving them one final opportunity to be honest. That realization hurts. Because if they understood correctly, you may have been waiting for them to say the exact words they were too frightened to speak. They remember wanting to stop you. They remember wanting to tell you not to give up. They remember almost saying, "Give me a little more time. I am trying to figure out how to make this work." But those words never left their mouth. And after you were gone, they convinced themselves it was too late. For a while, they tried replacing that emptiness with distractions. They stayed busy. They avoided certain conversations. They stopped mentioning you around people who might ask uncomfortable questions. From the outside, it looked like progress. Inside, it was completely different. Every milestone reminded them of who wasn't there. Every conversation about love reminded them of what they never finished saying. And whenever someone asked whether they had ever truly loved someone, your memory arrived before any answer could. That is the confession they have been afraid of. Not simply that they miss you. Not simply that they regret what happened. But that after everything, you remained the comparison they never intended to make. They began noticing how different certain connections felt because something essential was missing. The emotional understanding. The familiarity. The feeling that someone could recognize what was happening behind their silence. And whether or not another chapter between you is possible, your person can finally admit that what existed with you left a mark they could not simply replace. But they also understand something important now. Loving the memory of someone does not give them permission to disrupt that person's peace. That is why they have been so careful. If they approach you, they want to do it respectfully. They do not want to arrive demanding answers, demanding forgiveness, or expecting you to immediately trust their intentions. They know trust cannot be rebuilt through one emotional message. It requires truth, consistency, responsibility, and time. Your person is finally prepared to accept that. They are no longer imagining some perfect reunion where every painful memory disappears overnight. Instead, they are imagining something much simpler, one honest conversation where neither of you has to pretend. That is all they want first. One conversation. One opportunity to say, here is what really happened inside me. And one opportunity to ask, what was happening inside you? Because there is still something they desperately need to understand. During the period when everything was falling apart, there was one day when your person expected to hear from you. They waited longer than they ever admitted. They checked repeatedly. They kept convincing themselves that something would arrive. Nothing did. That became one of the moments they used to convince themselves you were finished. But now, after everything they recently discovered, they are questioning that day. What if you believed they didn't want to hear from you? What if something had already convinced you that reaching out would only cause more pain? What if both of you interpreted the same silence as rejection? That possibility has shaken them deeply. Because if it is true, then the story they have carried for so long may have been incomplete from the beginning. And this is where everything becomes more urgent. Your person recently made a private decision. They decided that if they receive even the smallest genuine opportunity to speak with you, they will finally ask about that day. They will ask what you believed. They will tell you what they believed. And they will stop allowing assumptions to write the ending. But there is something else. Before they make that move, they have started preparing themselves for every possible answer, including the one they fear most. They know you may say, "I waited for you too." And strangely, those words frighten them almost more than rejection. Because if you say that, your person will have to confront the possibility that both of you lost precious time because neither one understood what the other was experiencing. That would be painful. But it would also finally explain why neither of you ever felt completely finished with the story. And now there is one last thing your person wants you to know before they take whatever step comes next. If they finally reach out, they are not coming to rewrite history. They are coming to stop hiding from it. They want the truth, even if the truth hurts. They want your real answer, even if it isn't the answer they dreamed about. Because after everything that has happened, they have finally understood that an honest answer can heal something that years of wondering never could. And tonight, they are closer than ever to making the move they have postponed for far too long. The message is still there. Their confession is still there. Your name is still sitting in front of them. But now their finger isn't moving away from the screen. Because they have finally realized something. There may never be a moment without fear. There may only be a moment when love, truth, and regret become stronger than fear. And they believe that moment has finally arrived. But what they are preparing to say first is not, "I miss you." It is not, "Come back." It is a question. A question that has lived inside them for far too long. And if you answer it honestly, everything they believed about your ending could change. Were you waiting for me too? That question has become impossible for them to ignore. Were you waiting for me too? Your person has repeated it silently so many times that they can almost imagine every possible answer. But imagination is no longer enough. They have spent too much time building conclusions around things they never asked you directly, and they finally understand that another assumption could become another regret they carry for years. Something inside them has become unusually calm now. The fear is still there, but it is different. Before, fear controlled their decisions. Now it simply exists beside their courage. Your person knows they cannot control what you say, what you feel, or what direction your life has taken. The only thing they can control is whether they finally show up with honesty. And that honesty begins with an apology. Not the kind of apology designed to pull you back. Not an apology followed by excuses. A real one. I should have spoken when you needed clarity from me. I should have asked questions instead of believing assumptions. And I should never have expected you to understand feelings I was too afraid to express. Those words have become important because your person finally recognizes something painful. There may have been moments when you walked away believing you weren't important enough for them to fight for. They hate that possibility. Because inside them, the reality was almost the opposite. They cared so deeply that fear took over. They worried about making the wrong decision. They worried about disappointing people around them. They worried about what would happen if they chose their heart and everything still fell apart. So instead of making a courageous decision, they made a safe one. And that safe decision became one of their deepest regrets. But your person knows regret alone means nothing if it never produces change. Saying, "I wish I had done things differently," cannot repair anything unless they are willing to behave differently now. So they made another promise to themselves. No more disappearing when conversations become difficult. No more allowing other people to interpret your intentions. No more punishing you with silence because they are afraid of their own emotions. And no more expecting love to survive on words that were never spoken. If there is another conversation between you, they want it to be completely different. They want to listen without defending themselves. They want to answer questions they once avoided. They want to admit when they were wrong. And they want to hear whatever you have carried, even if hearing it hurts. Because perhaps you have your own confession. Perhaps there were moments when you almost contacted them. Perhaps you wrote something and deleted it. Perhaps you waited for an apology that never arrived. Perhaps you eventually became tired of waiting and chose your own peace. Your person understands that possibility now. And strangely, accepting it has made them even more determined to speak honestly. Because this is no longer about controlling the ending. It is about finally respecting the truth. There is something else they have realized recently. For years, they thought closure meant forgetting. They believed moving forward required them to stop caring, stop remembering, and stop wondering. But they couldn't. Now they understand why. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many conversations that ended before the real words were spoken. Too many decisions made while both hearts were still confused. That doesn't automatically mean you belong together. But it does mean the truth deserves to be heard. And your person is finally ready for that truth. They have imagined sitting across from you with nothing between you, no family opinions, no outside pressure, no old rumors, no third person explaining what someone supposedly meant. Just you. Just them. And one question at a time. What did you believe happened between us? When did you feel me pulling away? Was there something you wanted to tell me? Did you think I stopped caring? And finally, is there anything left between us that deserves one honest conversation? That final question terrifies them. Because your answer could change everything. But they are prepared to hear it. Don't skip this. Because something unexpected happened after they finally accepted that possibility. They stopped obsessing over whether you would choose them again and started thinking about what they would need to prove if you ever allowed them close enough to rebuild trust. That shift is enormous. They know words alone are not enough anymore. They would have to show consistency. Patience, respect, and most importantly, they would have to stop running when things become emotionally difficult. Your person knows they cannot ask you to believe they have changed simply because they say they have. They would have to demonstrate it. And for the first time, they seemed prepared to do exactly that. But then another memory surfaced. One they had almost forgotten. It involved something you said shortly before everything changed, words they dismissed at the time because they didn't understand what you were really trying to communicate. Now those words suddenly make sense. And when your person remembered them clearly, they froze. Because if they are interpreting that memory correctly, you may have tried to warn them that the connection was slipping away. You may have been asking them to choose. Not necessarily between you and another person, but between courage and fear. And they chose fear. That realization broke through the final excuse they had been holding on to. They cannot change what they chose then, but they can decide what they choose now. So they picked up the phone again. They opened the message. They read the confession one final time. And instead of deleting another sentence, they added one. I don't know whether I still have a place in your life, but I don't want fear to be the reason you never learn the truth. Then they stopped. Their finger moved toward the screen. This time, they didn't immediately pull it away. Because somewhere inside them, they had finally accepted that whatever happens next will be real. No more imagined conversations. No more invented answers. No more years of wondering. But right before they made that final move, they noticed something about your last interaction that they had overlooked all this time. One tiny detail. One sentence. And suddenly they realized you may have left the door open in a way they never understood. Now they need to know whether that door is still open, or whether they waited too long to walk through it.